keeping track of where government money actually goes. And it can feel like trying to solve a maze, right?
Absolutely. It's complex stuff.
But what if we could sort of map out some significant proposed changes in federal spending
Yeah,
in a way that, actually makes sense?
that's the plan.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we're doing a deep dive into the fiscal year 2026 discretionary budget request.
Right. This big document, it's essentially the president's proposal, a blueprint for how a big chunk of government funds could be spent.
Exactly. And our goal, well, it's to navigate this thing and really highlight the key areas where notable reductions are being proposed. And importantly, what that might actually mean.
Precisely. We've got this substantial document, the FY26 request, and we're going to pull out the core info. We're really focusing specifically on where the proposed spending cuts are targeted.
Yeah.
We want to give you a clear understanding of the shifting financial priorities without, getting totally lost in all the bureaucratic detail.
Right. So emphasis on the reductions in discretionary spending. And just as a quick reminder for anyone listening, discretionary spending, that's the part of the budget Congress decides on each year. Appropriations bills, all that. So we're going to pinpoint which government departments, which agencies are facing potential cuts. And where the document gives reasons, we'll talk about the why behind these proposed changes.
Makes sense.
So where do we start? Where are some of the biggest proposed reductions taking shape?
Well, one of the most significant areas right off the bat is the Department of State and USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Okay, state and USC.
The budget request outlines a pretty substantial overall decrease in their funding. Big drop.
Okay, a major proposed cut there. What kinds of programs are potentially on the chopping block? This is where it gets really interesting, doesn't it?
It does. And what's fascinating here is how specific some of these proposed reductions are. Well, the request explicitly mentions eliminating funding, completely eliminating it, for programs related to climate change, DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also LGBTQ plus activities abroad.
Wow, okay, so specific categories targeted. Where does that funding go then?
It's proposed to be consolidated, moved into a new thing called the America First Opportunity Fund, or A10F.
A10F.
Yeah, and this A10F is described as focusing on, quote, strategic investments that align with a certain foreign policy view.
So that shift suggests a pretty significant change in how the U.S. might approach these international issues, right?
Absolutely. A fundamental shift, potentially.
So specific funding for climate, DEI, LGBTQ plus stuff abroad could be gone, rolled into this broader A10F fund, maybe. What other areas of international affairs are looking at reductions?
We also see proposed cuts in what's allocated for international disaster assistance, migration and refugee assistance too, and the Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance, ERMO.
So humanitarian aid type programs.
Exactly. And these are also proposed to be consolidated into a new account called International Humanitarian Assistance, or IHA.
Another consolidation.
Right. And this is key, with a lower total proposed funding level than all those previous separate accounts had combined.
Ah, so consolidation and a cut overall.
Potentially, yes. It could mean less overall financial support available for those critical humanitarian needs.
Interesting. So potential decrease in funds for international humanitarian aid in this proposal. What reasons are actually given for these cuts at state and USAID?
Well, the document points to Executive Order 14169.
Okay.
The title is Reevaluating and Realigning United States Foreign Aid. That's presented as a guiding principle here.
Realigning aid.
Right. The stated goal is efficiency and alignment with an America First foreign policy. It also mentions reorganizing USAID within the State Department.
Okay.
And furthermore, it cites another executive order, 14151.
What's that one?
That one's titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing.
DEI again.
Yes. And citing that order, the request proposes eliminating what it calls non-essential staff, who were apparently hired based on DEI preferences.
So this indicates a really clear shift, not just in policy priorities, but potentially in personnel too.
Exactly. It's both.
Right. So a proposed fundamental change in how foreign aid is structured, who runs it, the priorities, the whole 9 yards, it seems.
Yeah.
What about other specific programs within state and USAID? Any other big proposed reductions?
Oh, yes. There's the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement Program, NCA.
And CAO.
That's also proposed for a funding reduction, and the rationale given is a shift in focus.
From what to what?
moving away from supporting things like criminal justice reform and foreign governments towards more direct counter-narcotics and border security missions, things seen as having a more immediate direct impact on the U.S. itself.
That shift in focus for INCA.
Yeah.
From helping other countries' justice systems to directly fighting drugs coming here.
Yeah.
That feels like a pretty significant strategy change.
It does seem that way.
What about international organizations, like the UN? Any proposed funding changes there?
Yeah, this is another really significant area. Huge, actually. The budget request proposes eliminating funding for peacekeeping missions.
Eliminating.
Entirely.
That's the proposal. Both UN-run missions and others gone.
Yeah. Wow. What's the justification for that?
They cite perceived failures, high costs, and the argument that the U.S. pays more than its, quote, fair share.
Okay.
The document even mentions allegations about UN peacekeepers being involved in drug trafficking.
Goodness, a complete proposed cut to peacekeeping based on those reasons. That's a massive shift in approach to international security.
It is, and it doesn't stop there. The request also suggests pausing most assessed contributions, the dues, basically, and all voluntary contributions to the UN and other international bodies.
Causing contributions to who specifically?
Well, it mentions the UN regular budget,
UNESCO?
the Cultural Organization.
Right, and the WHO, the World Health Organization.
WHO too, during ongoing global health stuff.
That's what the proposal says. It aligns this with Executive Order 14199. That one's about withdrawing from or ending funding to certain UN groups and reviewing support for all international organizations.
So, potentially pulling back significantly from these global institutions.
Potentially. Though it does add a caveat. It notes the president could choose to fund these groups through that new A10F fund at his discretion.
Ah, okay. So maybe some flexibility there, or leverage, perhaps?
Could be interpreted that way.
What about programs focused more on, like, cultural and educational exchange? Are those facing cuts, too?
Yes, educational and cultural exchanges are proposed for a reduction.
Reasons.
Stated reasons include concerns about not enough monitoring for fraud, inefficient programming, and also worries about foreign students learning high-demand skills here and then taking them back to nations considered rivals.
It really paints a picture of a broad rethinking, maybe a pullback from America's engagement on the global stage in many ways.
Seems that way.
Any other specific program eliminations at state and USAID that jumped out at you?
Yeah, several actually. Transition initiatives, or TI,
What are those?
described as short-term aid programs. The budget says they have no lasting impact on U.S. security and often fund NGOs with a, quote, leftist agenda. So, proposed for elimination.
Okay.
Go on.
What else?
The Complex Crisis Fund. Characterized in the document as a kind of slush fund for nation building and political interference.
Strong language.
Yes. And it allegedly was used to push DEI and LGBTQ+ policies. So that's also on the proposed shopping block.
Right.
And funding for the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. Proposed elimination there too.
YMB.
Concerns cited about lack of transparency in their grants and allegations they funded groups involved in, quote, disinformation and targeting conservative media.
That's a substantial list of proposed eliminations, each with pretty specific, sometimes pointed justifications in the request. What about global health, beyond just the WHO?
Global health programs generally, and family planning specifically, are proposed for a significant funding reduction. This is explicitly tied to the president's Mexico City policy and a stated focus on direct life-saving aid and preventing infectious diseases.
But any exceptions?
Yes. Notably, funding for PEPFAR, the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, is proposed to be maintained.
Okay, so PEPFAR stays, but other global health and family planning gets cut back. A more targeted approach there, it seems.
Exactly.
What about food security? International food aid programs.
Food for Peace, also known as Title II, is proposed for elimination.
Elimination, why?
Stated reasons: inefficiency, delays, waste, and even negative impacts on local farmers markets in recipient countries.
Okay.
The request does say they intend to keep other, supposedly more efficient food aid programs running.
Gotcha. Any other big international funding cuts?
Yeah, just to round it out, the budget proposes eliminating contributions to several big multilateral funds. The Global Environmental Facility, Climate Investment Funds.
Climate related.
Also the African Development Fund, and even several of the Treasury Department's international aid programs.
Wow, okay. It really does illustrate a significant proposed pullback in many, many areas of international engagement, both aid and participation in global bodies.
That's the picture painted by this request, yeah.
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's turn our attention to domestic spending. What about the Department of Education? Are we seeing similar kinds of proposed reductions there?
Absolutely. The Department of Education Ed is also facing proposed overall reductions across a whole range of programs.
Okay, what's a key feature?
One big thing is streamlining K-12 education programs. The proposal takes 18 existing programs. 18. And suggests consolidating them into one new K-12 simplified funding program.
Okay, streamlining, simplifying. That often suggests trying to cut costs, reduce bureaucracy, right?
Usually, yeah.
So what's the potential impact here on the actual money available for K-12 schools?
Well, the stated goal is to, quote, reduce ED's influence and the administrative burden. But importantly, they say they want to maintain full funding for Title I.
Title I, that's the big one for low-income schools.
Exactly. Financial aid for schools and districts with lots of kids from low-income families. So the idea is this new consolidated program would give states more flexibility in how they use that federal money.
More state flexibility. Okay. What about programs for students with disabilities? IDA.
Similar story there. 7 programs under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, are proposed for consolidation into a special education simplified funding program.
Okay. And the funding level?
Interestingly, the proposal says the funding level for this new consolidated program would stay the same as the 2025 level.
So consolidation in special ed, but maybe not an overall cut in the dollar amount proposed.
That appears to be the case for that specific consolidation, yes.
What other education programs are looking at potential cuts or even elimination?
Well, several aimed at college access and readiness for disadvantaged students, specifically the TRIO programs.
Well-known programs.
Right. And Gear Up, gaining early awareness and readiness for undergraduate programs, both proposed for elimination.
What's the rationale?
The argument provided is that access to college isn't the main barrier anymore for low-income students.
Really?
That's the claim. And that colleges and universities should use their own resources, endowments and such, to support these students.
That feels like a really notable shift away from the federal government's role in pushing college access for low-income folks.
It would be, yes.
What about federal financial aid itself? For college students?
Federal Work-Study, FWS, is proposed for reduction. The idea stated is to shift more responsibility for work-study back to the states and the individual colleges.
Okay, less federal money there.
And also, Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, SCOG, need-based aid for undergrads.
Yeah.
Proposed for elimination. They're called duplicative of Pell Grants and, quote, poorly targeted.
Okay, so trimming back federal involvement in higher ed funding, pushing more onto states and the institutions themselves seems like a theme emerging.
Definitely feels like it.
What about specific K-12 programs beyond that big consolidation we talked about?
Well, the English Language Acquisition Program, proposed for elimination.
Aye.
The argument is that it might, quote, de-emphasize English primacy.
Okay. What else?
Adult education programs face a proposed funding cut, with resources supposedly redirected towards programs focused on career prep.
Gotcha.
And programs supporting migrant education, also proposed for elimination, citing concerns about effectiveness and cost, and suggesting they encourage movement over stability.
And it's not just the program funding itself they're looking at, is it? What about the Department of Ed's own running costs? The bureaucracy.
That's right. The request proposes cutting ED program administration funding, too.
Right.
Reflecting the expected streamlining and maybe a smaller workforce at the department.
Makes sense if programs are cut or consolidated.
And several other post-secondary programs are also facing cuts. FIFPSE fund for the improvement of post-secondary education.
Right.
And graduate assistance in areas of national need. The reasoning, again, is that colleges should fund their own reforms.
There's that theme again. Less federal money, more responsibility on states and institutions. What about programs designed to support specific types of institutions, or maybe promote certain values in education?
The Strengthening Institutions program is proposed for a reduction, and the justification given that funds have been used to promote DEI initiatives.
DEI, yes.
Yep. Teacher quality partnerships, federal money for teacher training proposed for elimination. The stated goal is ending federal support for training on things like critical race theory and DEI.
Okay.
Similarly, the Training and Advisory Services Equity Assistance Centers, these help school districts with equity issues, also proposed for elimination.
So a very clear pattern of proposing to cut federal funding for DEI-related activities within the education system as well. Consistent across departments, it seems.
It does seem consistent, yes.
Any other notable proposed cuts at the Department of Education we should mention?
Yeah, a few more. The CCAM PS program, Childcare Access Means Parents in School, proposed elimination. Deemed unaffordable and maybe duplicative. Funding for Howard University, proposed reduction back to the 2021 level, citing that a one-time commitment for hospital construction is finished.
All right.
And finally, the Office for Civil Rights within the Department of Ed, facing a proposed funding cut with a stated refocus away from DEI and Title IX transgender cases.
That's a really comprehensive look at the proposed cuts in education. It definitely highlights a potential major shift in the federal role there. Okay, let's move to another huge area, Health and Human Services, HH, massive budget. What are the key proposed reductions there?
HHS is definitely facing significant overall reductions in this proposal, big ones. One of the most substantial proposed eliminations is LIHEAP.
LIHEAP, the Energy Assistance Program.
That's the one, Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, proposed gone.
Wow, why? That helps a lot of people.
The argument stated is that it's unnecessary now because states have rules preventing utilities from shutting off power for low-income folks. And they also cite concerns about fraud in the program.
Eliminating LIHEAP. That could have a really big impact on many households, especially with energy costs.
Okay, what else is proposed for elimination at HHS?
Refugee and Unaccompanied Alien Children programs, the UAC programs. Proposed for elimination except for the core mission of sheltering unaccompanied kids and protecting them from trafficking.
Okay, so scaling back significantly. Why?
Linked to a reported drop in refugee arrivals and also allegations of past misuse of funds under a previous administration.
Got it. What else?
The Community Services Block Grant, CSBG.
CSBG. That funds local community groups, right?
Yeah, a whole network of them. Also proposed for elimination.
Rationale.
Concerns raised that the money goes to groups with their own agendas focused on, quote, equity and green energy initiatives, and questions about overall program effectiveness.
Okay. Equity, green energy. Recurring themes for cuts.
Seems so. Also, preschool development grants, PDG, proposed elimination. Argument is they don't directly fund preschool slots and have been used to push DEI policies. DEI again. Okay, so several big support programs potentially eliminated. What about specific health programs within HHS?
Yeah, lots happening there too. Numerous programs within HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, are proposed for consolidation and reduction.
HRSA covers a lot, right?
It does. This includes parts of the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program that aren't direct patient care, various maternal and child health programs, health workforce programs, training doctors, nurses, etc., and family planning programs too.
So cuts across the board in HRSA, but maybe keeping some core functions.
The proposal suggests funding will be maintained for what they deem priority activities within those areas. So, yes, some targeting.
Okay. What about the CDC? Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Yeah.
Obviously critical for public health. Any big proposed changes there?
Yes. The CDC is also facing proposed program reductions. The stated idea is to refocus the agency on its, quote, core functions.
Like what?
Things like infectious disease surveillance, investigating outbreaks, maintaining essential public health infrastructure.
So back to basics for the CDC.
Kind of. Many programs related to chronic diseases, environmental health, injury prevention, global health work, public health preparedness, those are proposed for elimination or consolidation.
Why?
The argument is that state and local health departments are better positioned to handle those areas.
There would be a pretty significant shift in the federal role for broader public health issues, wouldn't it?
It certainly would.
Now let's talk NIH, National Institutes of Health, the big funder of medical research. Changes proposed there.
Oh yeah, a massive proposed reduction in overall funding for NIH.
Massive. Why?
The stated goal is to, quote, restore accountability and transparency in research funding.
Ow.
By consolidating tons of existing programs into just 5 new focus areas. These are aligned with the president's MAHA initiative, apparently.
5 areas. So what gets cut or eliminated?
The request proposes eliminating funding for research on minority health disparities, international health, complementary and integrative health, nursing research, climate change impacts on health, also research related to what the document calls radical gender ideology and divisive racialism.
That is a huge restructuring and refocusing of NIH research priorities. Very clear areas being defunded in this proposal.
Extremely clear.
What about mental health and substance abuse, SAM-HSA?
Several SAM-HSA programs focused on mental health and substance use prevention and treatment proposed for elimination.
Reasons?
Again, concerns about duplication and limited national impact.
Okay. And AHRQ, healthcare research.
Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, facing a proposed reduction too. Eliminating research projects called wasteful, duplicative, or not aligned with administration priorities, including research on climate change, health impacts, and gender-affirming care.
Okay. Consistent themes.
And just quickly, also proposed cuts to CMS centers for Medicare and Medicaid services program management, eliminating funding for non-statutory, wasteful, and woke activities, including health equity work and Inflation Reduction Act outreach.
Got it.
Also eliminating the ASPR hospital preparedness program called Wasteful, and eliminating or reducing some other HHS programs related to sexual risk avoidance, teen pregnancy prevention, minority health, and women's health.
It really seems like a top-to-bottom set of proposed cuts and reprioritizations across the whole health and human services landscape. Just a few more major departments to touch on. What about the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency? Significant proposed changes there.
Yes, the EPA is also looking at an overall reduction in its proposed budget. Pretty significant cuts proposed for the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds.
The SRFs.
Oh.
Those are important for infrastructure.
They are. The rationale given is to return them to their original structure as revolving loan funds at the state level, and also concerns about duplication with other funding and potential earmarks.
Okay, state-level focus again.
Right.
Yeah.
And categorical grants federal money to states for specific environmental programs also proposed for a big reduction.
Why those?
The argument is states should be capable of funding their own programs to comply with environmental laws.
So again, that theme, less federal role, more financial burden, shifted to the states.
Exactly.
What other EPA programs are facing proposed changes?
The Hazardous Substance Superfund for cleaning up toxic waste sites. Proposed reduction there.
Even Superfund.
Yeah, but they cite new PACS money coming from the infrastructure law, the IIJA, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Plus, potential money recovered from lawsuits.
Okay, so they think other money will cover it.
Seems to be the justification. Also, proposed cuts to the EPA's Office of Research and Development. Stated goal is to end what are called unrestrained research grants, environmental justice work, climate research, and some types of environmental modeling.
Environmental justice, climate research, cut.
And the Environmental Justice Program itself, proposed for elimination entirely, explicitly linked to those executive orders about ending DEI programs and preferencing in government.
And there it is again. DEI-related programs specifically targeted across different agencies. Very consistent.
Very.
Any other notable EPA programs with proposed cuts?
Yeah, DAO grants Diesel Emissions Reduction Act. Proposed elimination. Argument is they distort the market.
Okay.
And the Atmospheric Protection Program. Also proposed elimination. Characterized as government overreach imposing unnecessary climate regulations.
Okay. Moving on. What about Homeland Security, DHS? Big department, especially with border issues being so prominent. Increase or decrease there?
DHS is interesting. The overall proposal includes an increase, but that's tied to significant proposed increases requested through a separate process called reconciliation, mainly for border security and enforcement.
Ah, okay. So the regular discretionary budget part might see cuts.
Exactly. Within the regular discretionary budget, there are proposed reductions. For instance, non-disaster FEMA grant programs.
Non-disaster FEMA grants, like what?
Things related to preparedness, maybe? The proposal aims to refocus FEMA on core emergency management and explicitly end programs related to equity and DEI.
Okay, FEMA refocusing. What else at DHS?
CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Proposed reduction there.
CISA too. They do important work.
The proposal says it wants CIRSA to refocus on its core mission, defending federal networks, and eliminate programs related to things like misinformation and external engagement.
Misinformation work cut.
Okay. Also, elimination of the Shelter and Services Program. This is the one that provides funds often used for migrants.
Right. Why eliminate that?
The argument is it facilitates mass illegal migration and funds, quote, radical leftist NGOs.
Very strong language there.
Yes. And one more reduction mentioned is at TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, reducing screening levels slightly, framed as reducing wasteful spending.
Okay. So DHS is complex. Big proposed increases elsewhere, but targeted cuts in the discretionary budget, often hitting programs framed as non-core or related to specific policy areas like equity or migration support.
That sums it up well.
Let's talk Department of Justice, DOJ. Overall picture there.
Overall reduction proposed for DOJ.
How are they proposing to achieve that?
A big part is reducing what they call duplicative and unnecessary state and local grant programs, proposing to eliminate nearly 40 grant programs, 40, deemed not aligned with the president's priorities, failing to reduce violent crime, or being, quote, weaponized.
Weaponized? Which programs specifically?
They mention programs related to community-based justice, hate crimes, restorative justice, and grants going to organizations focused on equity and, quote, liberation.
Okay. Broad cuts to those grant types.
Yes. Also proposes realigning Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, funding back to what it calls its original core mission.
What else at DOJ?
Proposing to reform and streamline the FBI, reduce DC overhead, cut non-law enforcement missions,
Mike?
specifically calls out DEI programs and duplicative intelligence activities. The goal stated is to refocus the FBI on counterintelligence and counterterrorism.
Refocusing the FBI. Yep.
Also, reducing DEA's international presence in countries considered non-focus or wealthy, shifting resources to regions where drugs impacting the U.S. originate.
Makes sense strategically, perhaps.
And refocusing ATF enforcement. Cutting funding for offices alleged to have overregulated lawful gun ownership, and shifting resources towards fighting illegal gun trafficking.
Okay. A shift in ATF priorities.
And finally, reducing funding for general legal activities, specifically mentioning cuts to the Civil Rights Division and the Environment and Natural Resources Division.
Why those divisions?
Concerns cited about, quote, weaponization and alignment with previous administration agendas.
Okay, significant proposed changes and reductions across DOJ too. What about the Department of Energy, DOE? Big focus on energy policy lately.
DOE is also proposed for an overall reduction.
Really? How? Especially with energy being so key.
Well, a big part is proposing to cancel significant funds already allocated by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to the IIJA.
Cancel existing funds? For what?
Funds related to renewable energy, carbon capture, and electric vehicles.
Wow, clawing back infrastructure money for green tech.
That's the proposal. Also, reducing funding for energy efficiency and renewable energy programs, reorienting them to only very early stage R&D, and eliminating funding for what it calls green new scam interests and climate change activities.
Green new scam.
Oh.
Okay. Strong wording again.
Very. Similar cuts proposed for the Office of Science, cutting climate change and green new scam research there too.
Okay. What else at DOE?
Reducing environmental management funds for cleanup at various sites. Reducing ARPE funding, focusing it only on reliable energy and critical tech, not green news scam tech.
Got it.
Reducing the Office of Nuclear Energy for non-essential research. And reducing the Office of Fossil Energy, but refocusing it back towards researching tech for domestic fossil fuels and critical minerals.
So a clear shift away from renewables and climate, back towards fossil fuels and specific tech R&D.
That seems to be the direction outlined in the proposal, yes.
Okay, quick hits on a few others. Department of Transportation. Overall increase, I thought.
Overall increase largely due to infrastructure law funding flowing through. But there is a proposed reduction in discretionary funding for the Essential Air Service, EAS.
The Rural Air Service subsidies.
Right. Through reforms to eligibility and subsidy rates.
Okay. Department of Commerce.
Overall reduction proposed there.
Key cuts.
Reducing the Economic Development Administration, EDA, called wasteful, and the Minority Business Development Agency, MBDA, citing its DEI practices as unconstitutional.
MBDA cut for DEI reasons.
Okay. Also reducing NOAA funding National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, terminating climate programs, rescoping satellite programs, reducing NIST funding for climate-related work, and reducing the International Trade Administration's global market focus.
Climate cuts across commerce, too.
Got it.
Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD.
Significant overall reduction proposed for HUD. Really big changes.
Like what? This affects housing assistance, right?
Hugely. Proposing to transform federal rental assistance programs like Section 8 vouchers into a state rental assistance block grant.
Block granting rental aid to states.
Yes. And with a proposed 2-year time limit on assistance for able-bodied adults without dependents.
Wow, time limits on rental aid. That's a massive policy shift.
Massive. Also proposing elimination of the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG.
CDBG gone. That funds tons of local projects.
Argument is it's poorly targeted and better done locally. Same rationale for eliminating the Home Investment Partnerships program. State and local governments are better positioned, they say.
Okay, major block grant programs eliminated. What else at HUD?
Reducing Native American and Native Hawaiian housing programs, consolidating and reducing homeless assistance programs into a more targeted emergency solutions grant, reducing lead hazard and healthy homes funding due to unspent money, reducing self-sufficiency programs called ineffective.
More eliminations.
Yes, eliminating the PRO housing program cited for advancing equity, and eliminating fair housing grants, FHIP, and the Training Academy, arguing they advocate against single-family neighborhoods and promote radical equity policies.
So, huge restructuring at HUD, block granting rental aid, eliminating CDBG and home, and cutting equity-focused programs.
That's the proposal. Very significant.
Department of Labor, DOL.
Overall reduction proposed.
The main changes.
Consolidating various workforce development grants into a single Make America Skilled Again or MASA grant consolidation.
MASA grants.
Yeah. Supposedly gives states flexibility, but ends funding for progressive nonprofits and DEI-focused initiatives within job training.
DEI and job training cut.
Okay, also proposing elimination of Job Corps entirely.
Job Corps, why?
Cites a culture of violence, high costs, and poor outcomes.
Wow. And SCSF. Senior Employment Program.
Proposed reduction. Argument is it fails to move seniors into regular jobs and duplicates other programs.
Okay. Department of the Interior, DOI. Manages public lands, tribal affairs.
Overall reduction proposed there too.
Key areas.
Reducing Bureau of Reclamation funding, focusing on core water infrastructure maintenance, reducing National Park Service operations funding, aiming to streamline staff, maybe transfer some sites to states.
Transfer parks to states.
That's mentioned as a possibility. Reducing Historic Preservation Fund money, reducing Park Service construction, prioritizing big projects at major parks, reducing national recreation and preservation funding.
Lots of Park Service cuts. What about tribal programs?
Reducing Bureau of Indian Affairs programs supporting self-governance in communities, focusing on core priorities like law enforcement, cutting programs deemed ineffective, reducing BIA public safety funding, streamlining law enforcement, reducing BIE school construction funding, citing management issues.
Cuts across Indian Affairs too.
Yes. Also reducing USGS funding, eliminating grants to universities, cutting research on climate change and social agendas, refocusing on energy and minerals. Reducing BLM conservation programs aiming to undo land designations, cut funding to environmental groups. Reducing fish and wildlife grants to states and NGOs.
Environmental groups cut off.
Seems to be the aim. Eliminating renewable energy programs on public lands entirely, consolidating some fish and wildlife functions with NOAA fisheries, and consolidating federal wildland firefighting under DOI.
So, big shifts at Interior. More focus on resource extraction, less on conservation and renewables, cuts to parks and tribal programs targeting environmental groups.
That captures the main proposed directions.
Department of Agriculture, USDA.
Overall reduction proposed.
So where are the cuts falling?
Reducing NEFA research funding, eliminating woke programming on climate and DEI, cutting formula grants. Reducing ARS research funding, cutting outdated facilities, lower priority research, streamlining statistical agencies.
Climate and DEI and ag research cut.
Got it. Reducing NRCS conservation operations funding, noting lots of mandatory funding exists elsewhere. Reducing watershed operations funding, saying local dam owners should pay.
Okay. Rural development.
Streamlining rural development programs significantly, focusing on water, wastewater infrastructure loans and technical help. Eliminating lots of grant and loan programs deemed inefficient, duplicative, or not a federal role.
Big cuts to rural grants.
Yes. Reducing Farm Service Agency admin costs. Reducing Forest Service management and operations funding linked to expanding timber production. Reducing state-local conservation program funding, saying partners should pay themselves. Reducing forest research except for forest inventory.
Timber focus, less conservation and research.
Right. And eliminating the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, CSFP, for seniors.
Eliminating that.
Replacing it with proposed MAHA food boxes for seniors, sourced domestically. Also eliminating the McGovern-Dole Food for Education Program international school feeding, called inefficient and costly.
Wow. Major changes across USDA programs too. The Department of the Treasury. Mostly IRS and debt, right?
Overall reduction proposed, mainly by reducing IRS funding.
Cutting the IRS.
Yes. Stated goal is ending alleged weaponization of enforcement, increasing efficiency by cutting certain tax credits, improving tech.
Okay. Anything else at Treasury?
Reducing discretionary awards from the CDFI fund, Community Development Financial Institutions. Argument is the industry is mature, and past awards might have promoted racial equity and climate resiliency divisively.
CDFI fund cut. Gotcha. Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, usually gets increases.
Overall increase proposed, yes, mainly for medical care and the electronic health record modernization, but some proposed reductions too.
Where?
Reducing IT systems, spending, cutting duplicative old systems, pausing new procurements, and reducing general administration, eliminating DEI programs, non-essential outreach, cutting bureaucracy.
DEI cut at VA too. Okay. Corps of Engineers, Civil Works, Army Corps.
Overall reduction proposed, reducing spending from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund surplus, limiting it to core tasks like commercial channel maintenance, and eliminating the core WIIFIO water infrastructure loan program called unnecessary and duplicative.
Okay, NASA Space Agency.
Overall reduction proposed for NASA.
Cutting NASA where?
Reducing space science, terminating the Mars sample return mission called over budget. Reducing mission support, streamlining workforce, IT, facilities. Reducing Earth science, eliminating low-priority climate monitoring satellites, restructuring Landsat next.
Climate satellites.
Yes. Phasing out the big SLS rocket and Orion capsule after 3 flights, favoring commercial alternatives. Reducing space technology projects. Reducing International Space Station funding as it nears end of life, focusing research on Moon Mars. Reducing aeronautics, eliminating climate-focused green aviation work. And reducing STEM engagement funding.
So cuts across NASA, hitting big missions like Mars sample return, climate science, and ISS ops.
That's the picture.
National Science Foundation, NSF. Basic research funding.
Significant overall reduction proposed for NSF. Big cut. Reducing general research and education funding, cutting climate, clean energy, woke social sciences, low priority areas, reducing broadening participation programs, eliminating DEI initiatives there, and reducing agency operations funding in line with the smaller size.
Climate, DEI, social sciences cut at NSF. Okay, Small Business Administration, SBA.
Overall reduction proposed, mainly by consolidating entrepreneurial development programs.
How?
Ending 15 specialized programs, including women's business centers and SCORE that allegedly push a divisive agenda, leaving only small business development centers, SBDCs, and reducing salaries and expenses to match.
Consolidating SBA programs, cutting those deemed divisive. Got it. Lastly, the proposal mentions eliminating a bunch of small agencies entirely.
Yes, quite a long list proposed for elimination or defunding. Things like AmeriCorps, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Institute of Museum and Library Sciences, National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, several regional commissions like the Delta Regional Authority, U.S. Institute of Peace, a whole host of smaller federal entities.
Wow. Just eliminating them outright. Okay, that covers a massive amount of ground. So stepping back, what are the big themes you see across all these proposed reductions?
Well, as we've kind of touched on throughout, several key themes really jump out from this budget request. There's a very clear stated focus on what the administration defines as core government functions.
Right, like defense, border security.
Exactly. National security, in that sense, gets prioritized, at least in the overall picture, when you include the reconciliation requests. But alongside that, there's a significant proposed shift away from programs that are characterized, often quite strongly, as promoting radical ideologies.
Yeah, we heard that language a lot.
We did. DEI initiatives, certain climate initiatives, activities described as woke.
Yeah.
These are consistently targeted for reduction or elimination across many, many agencies.
And the other big theme seems to be shifting responsibility, right?
Absolutely. A major push to move functions and the financial burden for them away from the federal government and onto state or local governments, or even the private sector or individuals in some cases. Block granting, program elimination with the rationale that it's not a federal role. That's everywhere in this document.
So this deep dive gives us a really detailed overview of the proposed changes. It's crucial for you, the listener, to remember this is the president's budget request. It's the opening bid, essentially.
Exactly. It's the start of the process. Congress has the power of the purse. They will debate this, they'll change things, they'll negotiate. The final budget that actually gets passed could look very different.
Definitely. But this request, it's incredibly valuable. It gives us a clear window into the current administration's priorities, where they want to take federal spending the direction they're trying to steer the ship.
Absolutely. Understanding these proposals, even if they change, is really essential if you want to be informed about the potential future direction of government policy and spending. It raises huge questions.
It really does. Questions about the role of the federal government, the potential impacts on different sectors, different communities. Just massive implications. So, considering all these proposed reductions we've discussed, across such a wide swath of government. What do you see as the most significant potential impacts? And maybe more importantly, what questions does this raise for you about the future direction of government spending in America?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It certainly is. It's definitely a development that warrants close attention as the whole budget process plays out in coming months.